California legalized recreational marijuana back in 2016, but for many people applying to both private and public sector jobs, pot use has become an obstacle in getting hired. Now, one state legislator is proposing a new law to protect employees who use medical marijuana from being disqualified if they fail drug tests. Now, joining me now to talk about the proposed bill is healthcare attorney Harry Nelson. Thank you so much for being here.
Leslie, great to be with you this morning.
Okay, so what are we seeing right now, Harry, when we talk about the workforce and the jobs people aren't getting because of marijuana use?
So there's a lot of confusion out there. Even though California has decriminalized marijuana for medical use and for adult recreational use, employers are still permitted to not hire and to terminate employees for cannabis use. So you see different practices all over the place. We still have state employees in California, including the prisons, who are not getting jobs because they're using medical marijuana on a doctor's recommendation. You have that happening in the private workplace, and of course you have federal employees and people working with federal contracts who are also having problems because of use of marijuana.
Interesting. I was looking at the numbers in an LA Times article, and the numbers in the prisons, at least with prison guards, have gone up.
Oh yeah, 1,000 people.
Yes.
1,000 people applied for jobs in the CDCR in the California prison system, and were declined because of medical marijuana use.
And back in 2015, I think the number was like 500 were declined at that point, prior to it being legalized. But if this legislation were to pass, who would it protect?
So this law, it's important to remember, nothing is changing on a federal level. So if you work for the federal government, this doesn't help you. If you are a pilot or a truck driver in some of these industries where there's a heavy regulation of the risk of being intoxicated, it doesn't help you. But it helps state employees, the prisons, and anyone else in state government, Caltrans, who is using marijuana on a doctor's recommendation. And it also helps people in the private sector. People who are using marijuana would be protected from drug-free workplace restrictions and from any kind of limitations on medical use of marijuana.
And the legislation, like you were just talking about, does protect people with medical marijuana cards. But what is the process to obtaining those? How strict is it? How loose is it? We've seen it in the past.
So it's an evolving process, right? So the California was the first state in 1996 to allow doctors to recommend marijuana for any reason the doctor thinks it will help a patient. So it's a legitimate criticism that the standards remain pretty loose and that it's relatively easy to go to a doctor and get a medical marijuana card. That's something that we need to tighten up. So it's a complicated story here.
Yeah, and I was also looking at the numbers of the injuries that come along with maybe people who do use marijuana and the workforce, and it was interesting to see those numbers. So what protections would an employer have to then take? Would they have to take extra protections for their workers?
So first of all, yeah, there's some data out there. I'm always a little wary because it's being put out by the people who are opponents of medical marijuana, and if we really believe this is a therapy that's helping people instead of taking a prescription drug, we ought to be protective of it. But there still are protections for employers. Employers, in certain sectors, have if the job requires some kind of level of care where a person might be put at risk in an industrial accident, there's definitely room for employers to decide that it's not a reasonable accommodation. But this would not let employers use kind of wholesale, we just aren't going to hire anybody who's on marijuana.
Yeah, and let's talk about the testing, because unlike alcohol, we know marijuana is different for everyone when they use it. It could stay in your system for several days. It could stay in your system for weeks, just depending on who you are. But what does this say about testing potential employees? Is it fair?
It's a real tricky subject. Somebody out there is going to make $1 billion when they come up with a test that lets people breathe and tell you exactly not only when you used marijuana, but how much effect it's having on you. We all metabolize marijuana differently, and it's very hard to tell dosing, unlike alcohol. So it's a tricky system, and it's hard to know. And I think that it's putting pressure on employers to figure out more skill-based tests to figure out if somebody really has an impairment problem and can't function. And I think we still have a way to go on actually getting to a reliable indicator of how impaired somebody is from marijuana use.
And we have a way to go on this legislation, but thank you so much, Attorney Harry Nelson, for talking to us about this
So
today.
great to be with you. Thank you.